Amanda, so good to see you.
It's so good to see you too. I'm so glad we could do this.
Yeah, me too. Me too. It's been a long time coming, huh?
I know. I was like, we have to make it work. If I say wait, it'll be next year, right? Like,
Right,
let's do it.
right,
Let's do
right.
it.
And I can't believe I haven't seen you uptown yet. I
I
mean,
know.
yeah, yeah. So
It's
things are
coming,
changing.
hopefully.
Things are
The next
changing.
month. Yeah.
Next month, next month.
Vaccinated, all these good things. So that happens.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I don't even know where to begin. I mean, I guess I want to begin by saying congratulations. I mean,
Thank you.
it's incredible. You've got three projects on at the MoMA at the same time.
Yeah,
I
it's
mean,
surreal.
it's. Did you see this coming? I mean, how is it
No, of
possible?
course not. I mean, the having the color theory series acquired by the museum was already kind of, like magical.
Yeah,
Sean Anderson, who's curator in architecture and design, really kind of spearheaded that. And so, in hindsight, it's a kind of natural segue into the work that he was doing along with Mabel Wilson to really kind of shape the Reconstructions
instructions. Yeah,
exhibition. So, in their minds, this has probably been at least 3 years in the making. So in hindsight, it all kind of lines up very neatly and nicely, but in reality, it was kind of just flowing. And then
okay.
obviously the world is flowing in a kind of way where all of this is going to seem so, prophetic, right? But at the
Yeah.
same time, we're like, well, this and this and that. And so it's nice. It's nice too that you asked me to kind of center those three projects because in one's mind and you're making in real time so rapidly, you kind of understand the connections, but it's nice to pause and really see some of the through lines that are happening and then be
Yeah.
able to zoom back out.
Yeah, yeah, of
Um,
course. And in fact, I mean, the third project that you didn't mention yet is Embodied Sensations, which has a lot to do with this moment in time. So,
yes, which was just born a few weeks ago, and is just kind of open to public participation
right,
last week. So this
right,
is perfect timing to talk about all of these.
right.
Um,
Because I got to say, I feel bad because I took my students from Columbia up to see the Reconstruction show, of course, right? And then when I left, I noticed that you had another show there. And I said, wait a minute. Did I miss
I
something?
had a friend text the other day. She was like, you sort of underplayed the I'll be at MoMA. I didn't understand. But again, it also has to do with, when you're making work in real time, it's hard to be making the work and then talking about the work and then sharing with others that the work is happening. So
Yeah, yeah.
I think that's also a testament to the way designers in particular operate.
Mhm.
And that's no shade to artists writ large, but I think the average person assumes that artists kind of go make something in a vacuum and then it's like,
It's
and
born. Yeah. Yeah.
designer, my bifurcated brain, like the design component thrives on the idea of process and iteration. And so
Mhm.
if you don't have a fear of that, there's always fear, right? But there's no concern with like presenting it before you can even comprehend it, right?
Right,
Because we're
right,
just
right.
used to that as a kind of methodology of how we show up in the world. And
Mhm.
so it also was like, when you're all consumed by something too, you think everyone else in the world knows that you're all consumed with
Right.
whatever your stuff is, right? And then somebody's like, I didn't know you had a gyp shoe line, or I didn't know you were coming with. It's like, oh yeah, 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 yeah.
Wait, wait, wait. Is there a sneaker
So
line we should
there's
know
no
about?
sneaker coming. That is not the big reveal.
Okay, okay, good. I mean, I'm almost,
But
I was
yes,
concerned
I'll
for a
say
moment,
yes, right? That I know of for the rest of
but
the season.
someone's gonna do it eventually. MoMA to
Somebody is.
thinkers, right? Someone is. So, you just mentioned the bifurcated brain, and I think that's a really great segue into your background and how you position yourself, right? I mean, you've
Mhm.
studied architecture. You obviously think on some level like an architect, like a designer. We just talked
Yes.
about that, right? But you position yourself as an artist, and I'm interested not so much in your quote unquote love of color, right? Because I think that's a far too simplistic way of describing the broad uh,
Mhm.
breadth of your work, from drawings to paintings to installation to performance now, right?
Yes.
So then, what's interesting to me though is the way that you use the context or the freedom of art to, I guess, bring attention to ideas about space in new ways,
Yeah.
space and relations, etc., in new ways. So, tell us a little bit about your background, and how you found your way to architecture and to art before we get
Okay.
into the three
I'll
projects.
do you want me to start some of the slides and kind of talk through, or do you want me to talk a little bit and then
I'm
show
I'm
some things?
I'm I'm comfortable with, however. I mean, I guess if we start with color theory, that's gonna give us the
That's gonna
context we're
give us
looking for.
jump us in. I have one before that that I'll maybe jump into.
Okay.
I'll share, and then we can at least start there. Let me make sure it's all set before we get started. Um,
And of course, I'm from Chicago and also grew up on the
yes,
South Side.
yes. I'm
So
so excited to be talking to you. We met so many years ago, but
yeah. It's been.
you're my design hero. So
Oh, thank you.
this is fantastic. But I wanted to maybe pull this one up as we're talking, because to
Mhm.
your point about both Chicago and this kind of intersection, I think it's not necessarily special or unusual. It's the condition of a lot of people, Black people
Mhm.
in particular, in a city like Chicago, with there's such an imposition of the built environment is so central to a Midwestern kind of philosophy in Chicago, right? It's like there's a grid, there's order, there's not order. You stay here, you do this. It
Sure.
sets so much of a mindset. You know, there's always kind of like a rational solution. You live this many streets south, you live this many streets east or west, right? Like, and so I've heard it now that I've been able to go away. I lived in the Bay Area for several years when I worked after graduating architecture and actually practicing there. You know, my first inclination was like, well, how do you orient yourself?
Mm.
You know, people were like, let's go where I want to go, right? So then I really started to understand how your context or your environment is shaping you in these ways that were more nuanced than the kind of obvious ways that you're learning about urbanism or
Absolutely. And it's almost impossible to discuss Chicago without thinking about the lake, right? And
yes,
and the relationship of the lake to the park, to the city, right? That kind of
yes.
that
And
beautiful transition that allows you to be in the city and see the city at the same time.
that Burnham, you know, was so central to that, and sort of was in the DNA before I even understood who or what impact he'd made. And
Right.
then someone like Common, who's basically my contemporary, basically born about the same time,
Mm.
who's then starting to tell these stories in this very poetic way, that are also very spatial. And
Mm.
so I was just coming of age artistically and creatively at the same time that this music was blossoming. So for me, it was like headphones on in the studio, learning about Burnham, hearing this conversation about the corner, right? So this intersection. So I like to say that the love has always been for space and kind of understanding space.
Sure.
And I'd say maybe in the last decade, really understanding what it means to be able to locate oneself in space and have control over that kind of
Mm.
process.
Mm.
And so to really re-examine these ideas of power, racism, um, infrastructure, autonomy, all of these things through this lens of kind of a purist understanding of space.
Right.
And then really being able to expand and contract that, whether that's conceptual space, physical space, social space, and really let that kind of morph. And so architecture seemed like the initial route to that. It seemed very logical. And
Mm.
obviously, this is a great city to come of age as a designer, or to design is the way you want to show up in the world.
Yeah,
But
but then
really
also
it's about space, right? So that's where the art, that's where the leap comes, because it's really about asking questions. And
mm.
that doesn't mean that design isn't there, but it is very much so about wanting to ask the questions and wanting to have the freedom to ask it in whatever medium it needs to be in for that particular moment of that question.
Yeah, but I think we also have to make the distinction that design tends to place social issues at a distance. And I mean, maybe that is the kind of legacy of modernism, right? That there's been
Mhm.
this denial, this constant denial of the relationship of the built environment to particular people, right? And so
Mhm.
growing up in Chicago, as you did, right, there's always been this understanding of it being, I guess, at one point, the most segregated city in America, if not still, big city
Up
in
there.
America. And, you know, I remember hearing that Dr. King met his toughest resistance in the North in Chicago. And, you know, there's just that kind of, that wall that we used to see, right? Driving from the
Mm.
South Side.
Oh my God, yes.
It's like all of a sudden architecture begins at a certain point, right? And everything before it kind of forced you to wonder, well, what about our neighborhood, right?
Yes.
So I
And
think that,
the wall you're describing, for those of you that are tuning in, so along the Dan Ryan, which is our kind of, I guess it's also a little bit of interstate. It connects to some of the interstates, but it
mhm,
goes north south at about state almost for a good part of it on the south side.
mhm, mhm,
Um, and so right about, I don't know, probably about 55th, 50th, somewhere in there, begins the Robert Taylor homes. And it
right.
segues, I think, into Stateway Garden. So you have 31 blocks of high rise housing projects. And it was the wall. And I just thought it was impenetrable. And I could not imagine that it wasn't there, but it also was unimaginable. It was just like daunting and a burden,
Mm,
despite me not growing up in the projects, right? I grew up in Auburn Gresham, but it was like, why is it like that? What can we do? So this is
mm,
driving in my brain every day, and we're traversing this. And then to counter that with driving along Lakeshore Drive, which edges the lake, and seeing the Mesian, you
right,
know
right.
buildings right on the just north of Chicago Avenue. It's like they're the same building. It's the same building. They look just alike, right? And so that was my 7-year-old brain trying to make sense of these kind of
Mm,
things that look alike but are clearly very different in terms of how we're treating them, how they're valued, who gets to be in them, how you feel when you drive by them.
mhm. And I mean, segregation in Chicago was very much um, a building issue, an architecture issue, right?
Yes,
I mean, I would even want to discuss the third wall, which was for me that kind of facade of gleaming architecture that really designated the north and south sides, right? That kind of dividing line between, okay, now the gleaming
yes.
the beauty of Chicago begins, and all of the other places where we lived weren't participating in that somehow.
That's right. And even in doing my thesis, I would call it capital A architecture, right? It was like a crisis for me because I'd gone to school thinking I would get these tools to kind of fix what's going on, very naively, right? And then
Mhm,
I'd fallen in love with this very conceptual modernist education. And
mhm.
Corb is my boyfriend, right? I'm in love with this. And so now the, the fairy tale is over. The 5 years are up, and I want to be coming back here.
Mm,
And what am I building? What have I learned that I'm going to be building in where I'm wanting to build?
mm. And it reminds me of a kind of, I mean, of course, we have to talk about Du Bois, right? A kind of double consciousness
Yes,
in terms of,
yes,
what does the modernist educated designer or architect do if they're Black, right?
yes,
It's like Basquiat's irony of a Negro policeman, right? There's
yes.
there's this kind of inherent conflict because on the one hand, you love the purity of it, the vision of it, right? How it really changed things and brought about a kind of new form and new context for building. But on the other hand, you recognize it as the trap. I mean, the places that were built to contain our people, quote unquote, in the most negative possible ways. So,
And our invisibility, right? Like, so
and
you're
our
right, like
invisibility.
the very deliberate, systematic success of just making us not part of any portion of that story as
Right,
well. And so, what does that mean to then relish in something that you literally don't exist in? So
right.
how can you design those spaces for you to exist in? Right? And again, you're learning all of this. So this is all kind of being absorbed at the same time that you're kind of forming some kind of multiple identities, right? Your
Mhm.
cultural, um,
And trying to figure
and
out
all of
how,
these things.
absolutely, trying to figure out how you participate, right?
Yeah,
how do you go forward? So I think that's a really great backdrop for us launching into the work now. Uh,
yeah. I think, so then it seems again very tidy, but you imagine seeing these kinds of this is not a collage. This is one wall. Like this is one continuation at a stoplight, and it's the Pillow Queen mattress set for 199, and then Kina is still here.
mhm,
Call her at this number, right? And these colors, for advertising and commercial purposes, are trying to draw your attention and kind of hold your attention, but also an extension of a kind of style and flair that's inherent
mm,
in Black creativity across the board. And so, this is the kind of landscape I was traversing growing up, still traverse to this day. Most of these are still in existence. And so that kind of vibrancy actually led to me kind of joking with a friend that I was an expert in color theory. I was teaching a color theory class at IIT one summer. And my friend said, "Is that you can get credits for that? What are you doing?" And I was like, "Yeah, it's easy. It's color theory." And I was like, "I am an expert in color theory." So we laughed about it. And then I really started to try to parse what that might mean and to use that as a kind of framing device to think through work. And so it took a few years, but really then came down to an idea about setting a palette that would be part of a lineage of conversations of different scholars and artists and designers developing these palettes over centuries from Newton forward to really think about what would I add to that conversation. So this idea of, again, if our erasure or our absence, what do I need to add? And it wasn't because I wanted inclusion in that group. It was me trying to really own this thing that I gained as a kind of skill set, but what does it really mean to be able to apply it in a way that brings me joy? So there wasn't a premeditation that it was going to turn into this large public work. It really was about a fixation of trying to think about this as a palette of some kind, not knowing how I wanted to apply it.
and I
Uh,
mean, I think your
go ahead.
interest in it is perfectly normal and natural, and it's only within through the lens of blackness, right? That there has to be that the world expects an explanation somehow,
Yes.
right? And
Yeah, and
so,
so that's right. So there was a
yeah,
freedom because there was no thing or expectation. It really, there was a joy in it and a kind of humor in the way Black satire works. So I
mhm.
really literally was taking like, informal survey. This is my palette as someone who's come of age on the South Side in the 70s and 80s, which is going to be extremely different than the West Side, than 2005's palette, than 1940s palette, right? And so,
Then
across,
Joseph Albers, obviously,
yeah,
then Joseph Albers' palette, right?
yes, then Albert's right. But being able to then take the ideas of the strategies and the operations and think about what happens if you add this layer or you integrate this component. And so these are things that are kind of ubiquitous as colors, not necessarily happy memories or things that are directly related to my biography, but just part of my context. And so then again, it feels seamless, but then probably another year before there's a leap to really thinking about applying it to architecture, both as part of my biography, but also because this is the largest free canvas
Mm.
I could have to think about painting. It really was going to force me outside of an idea of painting on canvas in a more conventional way.
So
And
Amanda,
so,
I'm
yeah,
wondering, can you speak a little bit about what those colors mean? I know we're looking at Harold Chicken Red,
yes,
et
yeah,
cetera.
the
And I guess
colors.
I'm also wondering, did the cultural context come first, or did the colors come first? Were you interested in those colors before you then applied or related them to our common culture?
No, I thought of the culture first. So
Mhm.
that was, and I don't remember kind of what was the turning point. It probably was ultra sheen. It might have been currency exchange, but I was trying to describe it to a layperson because they it was like not connecting. It's like, well, there's colors, that it's like signifiers is a hard thing to describe, right? And it's like, well, what color is Halloween? And they're like,
Mhm.
oh, it's orange. Then they got it, right. So it's like,
Right, right, right.
so what color is blackness? And it's like, I don't know about that one, right? But then we start, and then this is also was a genuine question, right? Is it valid to say that blackness is crown royal, or blackness is hair
Mm.
products, or black, you know? So it definitely was a kind of a nuance I had to strike in terms of, I have an assistant here today, a nuance I had to strike in terms of not making it into a caricature, and really making sure that it was trying to narrate a moment, right?
Mm.
But a very particular moment, and then open up a conversation with people about what they feel blackness
Absolutely.
is versus needing to be black, right? So we're
Absolutely.
looking at Ultra Sheen and Pink Oil Moisturizer, which are two hair care companies that were founded in Chicago, but also were have become multi-million-dollar companies, right? And so there's a very important cultural, but also socioeconomic, kind of larger conversation going on. Harold's Chicken is the chicken king of the South Side, not to be rivaled by Remus on the West Side,
Or churches, let's
or
say.
churches. Popeye, right? So it's ubiquitous. But Harold, the Chicken King, I love in particular because he would make up these numbers.
Mm.
So, you know, Harold's Chicken number 62 might be on, 83rd and Ashland. And number 4 is on 68th and Ashland, right? And so it was to make the empires, I've been told, the folklore, seem bigger than it was. So you didn't know how many Harolds there were, and
Right.
Harold seemed super successful. So there's also a kind of projection. So all of these kind of have an attitude or an energy that connect
Mm.
also, and allow people to find kindred kind of connections through these little anecdotes and these stories. So
Mm.
for me, the narrowing down of these colors, I probably had maybe 5 or 6 more, was really about repeating them and having people go, oh, but what about, what about? So this kind of unscientific study to get to these colors.
But then again, they're also, I think about Black invention, right? You mentioned Ultra Sheen and how, that formulation becomes a multi-million dollar company, or you talk about Harold's Chicken and this kind of idea that he has to seem larger than he is in order to, you know, um, be successful, let's say. Uh,
Yeah.
but I understand it's very tricky terrain at the same time, because this idea of of defining Blackness from a design perspective, or defining Blackness from an architecture perspective, becomes very complicated.
Yeah.
And you run the risk of, on the one hand, wanting to communicate your point of view and your values, but on the other hand, making all of us seem so monocultural, right? Um,
Yeah.
and so I wonder how you grapple with that.
I mean, that was the daunting part of the project. You know, it's so funny to look at these pictures in hindsight. So my husband is peppered in each one of these. He's not an artist. He's an athlete. This is him. This is him
Mm.
bossing me around. This is him having invented some way to get to the top without climbing anymore. But it was, most people thought that the daunting part was that these houses, we didn't have permission to paint them. This was completely illegal.
Mm.
These are houses that had been slated for demolition, and so I'm doing a lot of kind of like, incognito
Mm.
kind of scanning of these things and making sure really that they are at the end of their life. So nobody's living in them, no developer can come and save them, no, like this is it. And so that really wasn't actually the daunting part. It's relatively easy, unfortunately, to kind of lay claim to things with no rights really for a
Mm.
whole portion of the city. If I were to do this on the north side, there'd be immediate phone calls, arrests,
Right,
all kinds
right,
of
of
things.
course.
The daunting part really was trying to make sense of what it means. And this is Pink Oil and Ultra Sheen and Flamin' Hots and Currency Exchange. The harder ones were Crown Royal and the loose squares. Because what does it mean to like make this temporary monument to loose squares
Right.
in your neighborhood that's going away, right? So it was actually quite painful often, and not that Flamin' Hots is great, but like you had this scale all of a sudden where you're like, well, Flamin' Hots is okay. And if you actually look at the trajectory, the last ones are the ones that I grappled with the most, right?
Mm.
Those colors. And then it's amazing that the reaction, in particular to the Crown Royal bag, was a gentleman that used to live on the block where the house was, who thought it was a beacon from Prince. And so I was sobbing, right? That he like he didn't see Cromwell. Like as soon as I told him, he's like, "Oh yeah!" And then he had a story about the bag, it's marbles, or the uncle who used it for film, or what, But it's like, you know, to have to think about it again, going back to what we talked about earlier, that's where maybe some of the design training comes in with this fearlessness about like,
Hmm.
I'm just going to do it because I know myself. I know that I'm from these neighborhoods, and I'm going to take the risk because I need to push further. Like I've done the right thing. I went to school. I learned what I was supposed to, and
Hmm.
it's not making the impact. So I need to get through this for myself, and then it's going to tell me, or it's not, and I'm going to keep it moving with another project like this. So it really was about that kind of level of risk, and maybe invention or innovation in a kind of way, right? That it was just
Hmm.
sort of like, let's do it and see what happens, and the worst that can happen is the thing gets torn down, because
Yeah,
that's
of
going to
course.
happen anyway. So that was trying to build in a safety net. And then of course, with best laid plans, right? Then the opposite happens, where people are like, you should save it, the city should save. It's a testament. It means
So,
we're still standing, and it took on all these other meanings that
mhm.
also are the narratives that you're pointing out about these companies and these colors as signifiers for so much more about what they imbue.
Well, you bring up saving it, and I think that that's a very interesting transition, right? That the building that was slated for demolition is now worth saving because you've painted it, right? And so I think that that for me is that all of a sudden people were seeing new possibilities, and something that was intended to be, a kind of blight on the neighborhood somehow, right?
And not just the neighbors who I thought would be enraged by a pink house. Thought they'd be like, what? There was only one instance where that really came to the fore. That I have, and I might have an image of it. This is we did a double house, currency exchange and safe passage, which is a term. I don't know what it's called on the East Coast, but these routes that they develop for kids to have to walk to school, and so they put these
Mm,
yellow signs, and then they
mm,
have these safe passage. Kind of adults that are beacons along the way, because they consolidated a number of schools and they were going across gang lines or across neighborhood territory lines. And so it was so ironic and odd, like this yellow brick road is going to save these kids.
yeah.
Not the fact that the system has failed them, or failed that we can't have schools in neighborhoods at a distance or in a geography that makes sense, but that these signs will save them.
Mm,
And so this was on the left is the currency exchange, and on the right is safe passage. And so this also was an Albers moment for me, where these colors are drastically different as little swatches, and they look almost the same. You can tell with the eye, if you train a little bit on it, you can
mm,
see a slight difference.
yeah.
Um, but it's exactly, what you were describing just a second ago. We're really trying to make sense of what this might mean. And there was huge resistance this day. And so I more and more I'm like, is it because it was yellow? Like something very beautiful about that purple. And this yellow is so arresting. And it also has so many other connotations that go beyond culture.
Right.
So,
Mm,
that's also a kind of interesting kind of way to have to respond in real time to something you've done to spark a reaction. And
mhm.
then I also have all of these other eyes all of a sudden all over the world kind of trained on this and reading so many other narratives into it. Um,
So I guess it brings me to ask you, is this really the project or the moment that you felt you transitioned from architecture to art, or at least that the two kind of met in your mind, and what did that mean for you?
yeah, it really was the moment, and more so because so I worked for almost 7 years in the Bay Area and worked at great firms, and kind of, had the birth lottery. So I was there when the economy was high, and Silicon Valley was in full bloom, and then was able to walk away to paint. And so I was doing oil painting full time. I left and had been painting for several years. So
Mm,
this is also the first project where I was not denying one part of myself. So there was, for some reason, very important to me not to mention my design background as I kind of evolved as a visual artist. So I would just
mhm.
not even tell people I had that background. And
And
then,
yet your canvas is architecture, right?
yes,
So
so this is the return. It was like, well, why is, like, it's not bad. And
Mm.
so it really forced me to kind of have to do some soul searching about why the rejection, why not a different approach to the absorption, and then also why the insistence that painting is oils on canvases. Like
Mhm.
it's so
Mhm.
it's also very naive and kind of, romantic that, it's like I'm a painter. It's like very important as a visual
Yeah.
artist that I was a painter and I was an abstract painter. And it was
Right,
like,
right.
what is all that about? And so this really literally pushed the limits of all of that, right? Like this
Mhm.
pushes it to another realm beyond painting in that conventional sense and beyond architecture in the conventional sense of
Mhm.
how I was understanding it.
Well, I'm really inspired by your use of language and the way that you are seeking freedom to, as opposed to freedom from. Um, and I think that, I'd love for you to explain or talk a little bit more about that and the way that architecture is always seeking to solve a problem. And here you weren't necessarily seeking to solve a problem. So it's kind of freedom to be an artist using architecture as your canvas, but freedom from architecture as a solution at the same time.
Yeah, and I think it came from a moment of kind of desperation is too strong of a word, but it definitely was sort of like just at my wits' end. This
Mm.
is not far from where I grew up. This is Inglewood proper, but I grew up in Auburn Gresham, which is maybe 10 minutes further south and west of this location. And it's like just to grow up your whole life with this, and then that third wall that you mentioned, kind of opulence of downtown, and
Right.
this thing that you can't ever attain. Like you're always even symbolic, like you're moving towards it, and then you're just kind of there, and you don't quite know when you weren't where you were, and
Right.
how are we supposed to make sense and reckon with all of this? And so really just giving up on that as a proposition, or rejecting that as a kind of trajectory, and saying this clearly is going to be something that's important to me the rest of my life. This clearly is not going to get solved.
Hmm.
I've achieved I went to the best schools. I paid attention. I didn't skip class. I absorbed everything from the experts and the masters and the veterans, and I, studied and traveled, and still it's just like this. So what else? Like if it can be anything, why not be something that I'm growing from and bringing me joy? And so that really was biographically the moment of freedom.
Hmm.
And you can
Hmm.
also imagine, wonderful parents that were heavily invested in my brother and I's education, financially and otherwise, and just be like, yeah, I'm not gonna do it. Nope, I'm not gonna do that. And and to be like, but I'm okay. I will not be in your pocket. I will be
Yeah.
fine. It might not
Yeah.
be what you thought, but it's fine. Right. So it's also just like shedding the burden of like the
Mm.
problem solver,
Expectation.
the
Yeah.
savior, the
Yeah.
expectations, and then to just do what you feel, and then the reward to be when you do that, it actually surpasses anything you could have imagined, right? And so
Well,
that's what the project keeps meaning over and
yeah.
over again.
Yeah, and there's also this relationship, I think, of abstraction to identity that's happening here. And if we look at the kind of trajectory of the Black art world, let's say over the
Mhm.
past, I mean, it's really so recent. It's
Yeah,
incredible how recent.
20, 30 years even.
Yeah, it's really 20 or 30. So, but that being said, I mean, it's so refreshing that you have not left your history behind, that you are dealing with identity, but you're doing it through the mode of abstraction at the same time. And I think that I mean, that's a very liberating space to operate in, and one that I don't think that many of us are comfortable operating in, because it requires I think a kind of visionary framework, right? That you have to say that you're moving beyond something, that there's something that you can't see that's
Yes.
still inside of you, but that you need to approach through this work. So I'm wondering, and this is maybe a tough question, but I'm wondering how do you respond to your detractors that look at this as simply a decorative project?
So this is also where being constantly behind with being connected to the world and the way the world has advanced in the interconnectivity
Hmm.
is the savior. You saw my daughter peek in, one of two daughters, right?
Yeah.
Just always behind. So I really had no comprehension of detractors because I was so invested in the excitement of like something that was a breakthrough for me that
Mm,
I largely missed as it was happening, the kind of moment of vulnerability of making something you can't explain and you don't quite understand, and then having people question you. I wasn't hearing the questions
mm,
until I'd had a moment to kind of pause and be like, yeah, this is all right. This is what this means for me. And then so then the questions about all of that um, seemed a little banal because it was like, well, what is your assumption that what you're doing is for? Like, why do you think you're a designer? Or why do you think you're entitled to kind of name things? Or why do you, I have two friends that have quotes that I like to use often. One, Kimberly Hill, she says, "I'm Black, deal with me." So so she like, she likes a kind of not confrontation, but she does like a confrontation, but she kind of likes a moment though you have to really stand your ground in what you're saying. And I have another good friend, her mother says, if you have a problem with me, go tell somebody else. And
right,
so those two together were kind
right.
of armor because I really, I'm a collaborative person and I'm friendly and I'm always smiling. So I am always open to like what people think and but not because I need that approval. It's really because I want to absorb it. So I
Mm.
feel like those two statements, those served as kind of armor for when I emerge at MoMA or when I emerge, and it's like,
I mean,
I belong here. Yes, because I'm doing the same thing that you are doing, and that project is doing, and this
right,
project is doing. It
right.
shows up differently aesthetically, but it's the same process of framing a concern and kind of working through it in a skilled fashion.
Mm.
So you don't have to like it, but you can't question it. I don't know what I'm doing.
Hmm. And it's back, I think, to that idea of not being willing to explain is viewed as a confrontation, right?
Yes.
So almost as if the work can't speak for itself, that you then have to justify your reason for doing it, your reason for being, your reason for saying what you said, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it's so important that we maintain that distance from, constantly having to explain ourselves.
Yeah,
That
which is also complicated by the fact that that's how design operates, which is very different than art, right? So design, we're trained to kind of have that thesis at all times and that premise, and to really be able to validate it through some kind of operational or material move, or
Mm,
so also to liberate yourself from that. Be
mm.
like, nope. Well, why'd you put this one on the left and that one? Why is it currency exchange at this? That's
Well,
how we put the cans down.
well, we're going to get to, I mean, we have quite a lot more to look at, so we better get moving. But I think that, we're going to get to the fact that you presented poetry as part of Reconstructions, and
Yes.
rather than a treatise, rather than an academic text. So I really want to talk about that as well. So please,
I'm
let's.
gonna I'm gonna fast forward through these. So this was a great moment recently.
Hmm.
Um, my daughters both were helpers in the painting. My husband was the foreman, if you will, of the process. He went from like being like, I don't understand what's going on, to being like, all right, here's how it all operates. He's like, directing people at these sessions. So it was really beautiful for them to be able to see it, and to in terms of the idea of freedom too, and also about territory, to
Hmm.
also see how much real estate um, Sean opted to give to the works in this space as a kind of moment to also make a position for why this was included in this sequence. So this is the gallery building citizens exhibition. So I think it's either come down or it's about to come down, but it's had an almost 2-year run. So really beautiful to be in conversation with these. Beyond this wall, and the backside of this is a film, and I'm losing the author's name right now, about Pruitt Igoe. So it also
All
was
right.
really beautiful to kind of see the view lines and the through lines through these works, both realized and speculative.
And it's,
And
I
I'm
mean, those,
almost tempted to jump from Embodied Sensations and maybe I'll jump ahead to Reconstructions and come back
yeah, I think that's a good
if
idea.
if you want
That's a
to.
good
So I'm
idea.
going to go really fast. Everybody's
Interesting that
listening.
you mentioned Pruitt Igoe. I saw that exhibition. I got to see your work there and see the Pruitt Igoe video. and there's also Gordon Matta Clark included in that
Yes.
exhibition. And so I was looking
And
at
Rachel
your,
White Reed,
and Rachel White
all
Reed.
heroes, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I mean, I think that those four that we've just mentioned have very different strategies toward confronting work at the limits of its lifespan, let's say, right? Rachel White Reed is casting to preserve it. You're painting to acknowledge it. Gordon Matta Clark is cutting through, right, to reveal it, let's say. And then we look at Pruitt-Igoe. I mean, it's we have to demolish it, right? So those are all very interesting and completely different strategies for dealing with similar issues, I think. So now, Reconstructions. I mean, this is a breakthrough exhibition. Uh, Correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't believe that there has ever been an exhibition of all Black architects at the Museum of Modern Art, and there is clearly a dialogue between the exhibition and the Philip Johnson gallery that it's presented in. And so, please take us through
Yeah,
that.
I think kind of piggybacking on a comment that you made a few minutes ago, there was a statement that Yolanda Daniels, who's one of
Mm-hmm.
the other participants in the exhibition, made, and she said, there will probably be, we were in advance of the show opening, we were doing an interview with Michael Kimmelman, and she was saying, there'll probably be a failure to understand that any criticism of this show about not sort of honoring our foremothers and forefathers who should have had several shows by now,
Mm.
meaning that we had the burden to then show that kind of work. And so we did a kind of jumping of the shark almost, in a sense, in terms of really having the freedom to make whatever work we wanted to make, to talk about this subject in the way that we wanted to, not to ignore the lineage or the legacy or those who got us there, but to really say, isn't the ultimate testament or tribute to make exactly the work you want to be making, and let
Right.
everybody else figure out why and how come, and that one doesn't stand up, and I don't know what that's about, and this show isn't doing X, Y, or Z, right? To really just kind of own, in that same way, that moment that was a breakthrough for me personally with color theory, to kind of do the same thing. And in doing so, actually our bodies are enacting a kind of freedom that we're trying to speculate upon with these projects that are designed at all manner and level of abstraction and speculation. And so,
Absolutely.
um,
It, it, it
so go ahead.
no, it makes me wonder about the manifesto. We probably shouldn't begin without saying that collectively as a group, the architects in the exhibition came together to make a statement about why. Well, I don't know if it's why, but I don't know if it's how, but
Well,
it's kind of
it
all of
really
those
came
things.
from that moment of freedom, right? So,
Mhm.
and I'll show a couple of images at the very end that show the literally the manifesting statement that we produced as a collective.
Mhm.
Um, so it was a moment where we recognized that this wasn't exactly how we imagined it might be going down, right? So it's not sort of like, in that same way that you don't want to necessarily achieve a position of prominence or power and just be like the colored in version of whatever used to be there or have been there historically, right? And so
Mm.
when you finally have this moment to occupy the space, what are you going to do with that moment?
Right.
And so we also were, Sean and Mabel also had us receive a presentation from Saidiya Hartman and Tina Campt on the practice of refusal
Hmm.
and their refusal collective, to preamble the show. So I mean, what are you going to make when somebody's infusing you with that level of motivation? There was one point early on, we're like, we're not going to make anything. We're going to refuse we're going to have an empty gap. I'm just going to stand there and say, none of your business. That is, and I'm laughing now because I told Sean, I was like, oh, but I'm not a performance artist. And he says, okay, then make something, it's like an
Right,
irony of
right,
all that. Right.
right.
But we knew we wanted to do something that was going to live beyond the exhibition. And so as a response, and a response could have been that we were going to remove our work or we weren't going to participate as a kind of action against not wanting to be having a conversation in proximity to someone whose whole oeuvre and legacy was about us being invisible, about us not being there. That's the politest way to say it, right? Or the much
Right.
more extreme is like,
White supremacy.
yes.
Yeah.
And so what can we do? And so that was our response,
Mm.
not to complain, but to be productive, to generate, to
And
be
Amanda,
fruitful.
yeah, just to clarify, weren't all of these projects commissioned by the MoMA?
These projects, these are actually 11. There were 10 of us who'd come together, and David Hart is also included. So there are 11 newly commissioned works that are part of this exhibition.
David Hart, the conceptual photographer,
Yes,
also working in the space of architecture, who I hope to have on the show at some point.
yes. So and beautiful work that's also talking about Watts. So helping also to kind of round, Yolanda's dealing with LA, but really also continue to round that conversation. I'm
Mhm.
gonna just flip through these so that folks can see a little bit, but I thought it was good to start with this. I'm kind of in the corner. I'm offering you these instructions, which you have to make sense of for yourself. And this little device, this little capsule, space boat ship vessel capsule, I call it, that's got a rib from our slave ship, that's got inventions from mailboxes and ice cream cones and all kinds of things that really are wrapping you in that legacy that you've talked about so beautifully early on.
Mm.
And so this is a Marcuse quote, that always has always stuck with me about what would a free society do? And a little Black girl saying, for the first time, we'd be free to think about what we're gonna do. Do
Mhm.
nothing. We're just gonna sit there and think about it.
Right.
And so I honed in on Kinloch. We each took on a city or a town. So Kinloch is one of the first free Black towns. And so also to pay homage to the fact that we've already had free space in the United
Mhm.
States in an iteration, and what does it mean to honor that and to move into that. And so in Missouri, what did it mean to go from being owned property to being a property owner?
Mm.
Um, and so how do we embrace that legacy of innovation, and there's humor infused in that, but there's so many Black inventors that were coming right at that time of
Yeah.
Reconstruction or just after. And so what might it mean to both see the continuation of the legacies or the promises not kept, but also the things that encourage us to keep going. So I actually applied for a patent. So it's a very long process. So you see the receipt on the wall in the museum. But I have a good friend that works at the patent office, and he said, "Oh yeah, you can apply for a method. Nobody can tell you that you can't tell people how to navigate to free Black space." Because I said, "Can I own free Black space?" He's like, "You can try. I don't know why you think the patent office is the people that can tell you whether you can do that." Like so fun, right, and liberating in that way.
But
And
it's important to talk about this idea of Black space and free Black space, and the notion that, I mean, in a lot of ways, your project was for me, stood out because you tried to kind of propose a more conceptual framework, right? And not necessarily looking at a kind of architectural solution, but looking at a more kind of poetic approach to the freeing one's mind. And there's some there's some statements that really jumped out at me that I want to.
oh, with the poem. So
The poem's fantastic. It's
I'll
really
see
cool.
if I have any. These are just a few. I love the way that they had to, this thing lowers and comes out. I'm trying to think if I've got a close up of the poem. I don't think I do, except for
Well,
that.
I have some quotes written down here because I
Oh,
thought that in many ways the poetry really got at the ways that when people outside of Black culture try to approach Black culture, there's a kind of otherness that happens, right? Where they're trying to understand what we're talking about or how we're thinking, and so they inadvertently other us in order to kind of study us, quote unquote. And there's this idea of the proximity to Blackness inherently making someone cooler or more interesting or more so they themselves inherit, right, this
yes.
otherness. And So, what's great is that you intentionally keep it elusive somehow. So you're admitting the cool by association, but denying it at the same time. And I'm wondering, you say something like Black space will not change things. Black space needs to be changed. You say, please, you say Black space code switches. Black space is messing with your head, changing up your point of view. Black space shall Black appoint you, because Black space is to be continued in your mind, in your mind, in your mind. So, I love these poetic descriptions, and I'd love to know what you mean by some of these, especially the Black space needing to kind of
to change
needing to change, needing to reinvent itself.
well, it's so it goes back to what you were talking about in the very beginning with Du Bois also, right? Because at every turn, I mean, how many times a day, I'm sure it happens in your family, it happens in my family all the time, where people say, "Oh, I just love Black people. I love us. I love us." Like, so people are mad at the Oscars, but they're watching. You say, "Did you see Daniel? Did you see when he was hugging Leslie? Oh, I love us. I love us." And then, and then they look out the window and say, "Would you look at your cousin? Look at him. Look at him right now." Right? So this disgust and love at the same time constantly. And so it gets projected onto space when, again, I live in Bronzeville now. We chose to live in this all Black neighborhood that we're going to invest in and really make our own and really try to make better through our efforts.
In
And
Chicago.
in Chicago,
Mhm.
and then at the same time, you're like disgusted that the people at the grocery store, the product is not there, so
Mm,
you're like, this is unacceptable. This
mm,
is unacceptable. And you're like, no, that's exactly where I want to be. Right. So the poem gets at that kind of like contradiction all the time. And we see it across every medium. We see it across every moment in creative production, whether that's jazz or blues, hip
mm.
hop, sports. Everywhere you turn, you see that kind of dichotomy, and we know it's all rooted, in the ways in which we were brought here and had to make
Right,
sense of that of that
right.
cognitive dissonance. And so the poem actually really works so well because it's a riff off of Muta Baruka's Dis poem. And so it's really talking about poetry itself and a kind of moment of frustration of, you know, it's not even writer's block, just kind of like being in love and absorbed with something that's like fighting you at every turn. And so
Mm,
that seemed like the perfect metaphor to me for both architecture, but also space. And my decision, to your point, that I was not going to engage in a conversation about architecture. I was, because early on, the feeling to me was that we've been brought here to like fix it or demonstrate how it could be fixed as if we created the problem. So it's like,
right.
I'm going to leave all of that over there,
Mm,
and I'm just talking about space, and I'm talking about how we can get there, and we need to get there. We have no idea how to get there. And
right.
here's the map. Here's the map for you. You can get there. You know how to get there. So it has a little bit of everything. It actually takes its compositional cue from FAA flight patterns. So this bottom one that you see here is actually the kind of flight information you need to travel from STL, which is St. Louis, and then somewhere further up here is Chicago, and then
Mm,
Kansas City is over here. And then you actually see Missouri, that kind of outline with the white portion. So there's so many, it's like a good painting, right? Of like,
mhm.
of all these kind of layers, and this, why is the dog in the corner, and the collar means this, and all, there's so much stuff in
And
here
it's
that tells you these stories. And then it's an emergency blanket.
right.
So
It's a
you're in a
collage
perpetual
that,
state of emergency as well, in terms of how you're going to get to wherever you're going. It's always urgent.
so I wonder, I mean, is this artwork available as a kind of, you mentioned the patent that you applied for. Are you making this artwork available as a kind of emergency blanket for people who spiritually want to be in touch with getting there, quote unquote, getting to free Black space?
Yeah, this again is the kind of gift and curse of having to make in real time. We were commissioned to do these at the at late mid to late 2019, and the pandemic occurs and throws time and space out of the window. But you're
Yeah.
trying to make in real time. But really, I am quite interested in then continuing this process. So just on a very basic level, this is screen printed, ironically by Sputnik Press here in Chicago, onto these
Mm,
blankets. But I really am intrigued now with the idea of like, what happens if they were to become a garment, or what happens if you wear. And so I'm thinking of everybody from Joe Overstreet and the sales.
Hmm.
He has a beautiful piece that I had a picture of. We had to go there to get here. We had to come from there to get from here. Like, even the title was evocative of how I was thinking. But what does it mean to have a garment that both gives you the instructions and is a protection? And
Yeah.
so the space boat ship vessel capsule kind of becomes that as well, that it literally is imagining this blanket wrapping into itself and taking on some other mechanism
Believe,
to protect.
believe it or not, for me, I immediately saw P-Funk and the Funkadelic.
Of course, but again, you're sort of like, you're like,
Right,
like,
right.
that's the mothership,
The
and that
mothership.
label when it arrived in that case, and it's like, coming out of that case, she says the mothership has. She texted me, the mothership has landed. And I was like, if only, But
Right.
again, you see that these tropes that we use, span and kind of interweave in and out. Like, I'm decidedly not an Afrofuturist in the sense that I don't feel like I fully understand what that means. Not that I would reject it, but you
Right.
can obviously see correlations to ideas about realities, freedoms, so on
Right.
and so forth.
And obviously there's a tradition, and I mentioned P-Funk because we need to acknowledge that there is a tradition
Yeah.
of Black artists in entertainment, obviously in literature, in design, trying to kind of find that place, that kind of mythical place where we don't have to deal with the burden of double consciousness, where we don't have to deal with, this kind of internal struggle. And the idea that I think what is really interesting here for me is that you kind of embrace that internal struggle and really define it as a part of Black space, like it's inherently part of Black space somehow.
And I don't know that I've done it successfully, but I also was invested in, at least, the idea of, I don't know if it's, I don't feel like I've pushed it yet with this, of deep space also, because it's so seductive to think of outer space. And then I got locked into that ship, but you will see the bow of the boat, and Christina Sharp's In the Wake plays a huge part. And there's actually a ripped page. You see me holding a ripped page here
Hmm.
from her work, but also navigating very deep space. The bottom of the ocean is just as mysterious as whatever NASA is doing. We haven't even kind of scratched the surface of what those components are. So
Right.
it really is any extreme space, and then to make that relationship to us here physically on the ground. So
Mm.
this was just to make sure that folks were able to see an image. This is the manifesting statement that we created a textile for. So it's raw cotton, backed with black denim, and it's laser cut. And so it's our manifesting statement. It's kind of our declaration of coming into being in existence. And so it covers the name of the gallery so that you enter kind of on our terms and really understand it. And we've been using this image of the exodusters in Nicodemus, Kansas, who left the South and were self-determined, and kind of a representation of, in my mind, this free Black movement in space. I like to think this woman's got some kind of heater behind her arm. She's got back there. She's like, and can we help you? How are you today? So on the one hand, it seems like this, kind of pastoral, nostalgic image. On the other hand, it's like, what's really going on here? And so I think that's the heat we're trying to bring with what we're doing,
Mm.
and we're going to be doing beyond the exhibition. Like, really, we are a 501c3. We formed in the span of time of the exhibition, and really working now. 10 people who are friendly but not necessarily friends, really battling it out to really say, what kind of impact can we make?
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's such an important moment, and I'm so happy that you were here to share it with us, huh? Thank you
Yeah.
so much, Amanda. I think this is a perfect way to end it. This has been great. Uh,
Thank you so much. I have loved, as you can see, we can talk for hours. So
I know, and we need to, huh? We
yeah,
really
we
need
need to.
to.
We will. I'm going
We
to do
will.
one shameless plug for Embodied Sensation, since it's up
Okay,
right now. Just end on that image for everybody.
please.
Um, and it is about right now. Go see it. It's up through July 20th. You can go to MoMA.org/Amanda Williams, and it will pull you to this, and you can sign up to have your body embody the sensations that we've all felt, but others have felt forever in this last year of chaos
That's right.
and
That's right.
intensity. But thank you so much for having me. This was wonderful.
Thank you, Amanda, and so glad to see how productive you've been during this difficult time. So,
When I said I was going to refuse to do anything, so I hate to see what I would do if I wasn't refusing. But thank you.
all right, Amanda, we're going to be in touch. Okay.
Yes, sounds good.
Thank you.
All
Thank you,
right.
everybody.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.